Let's just wait for our friends to open their cameras and their mics. You can do it now. Okay, wonderful. On behalf of CEBRI, I welcome you all to this webinar. First of all, I want to thank BOCOM Bank, which is the sponsor of the Asian debates here in CEBRI. The title tonight of tonight's webinar says it all: a new age in Chinese politics. The political reality of China is changing. The change is consolidating old and new concepts such as the great rejuvenation of the country, common prosperity, socialism with Chinese characteristics for a new era, and even what the Chinese call sometimes, quote unquote, their democratic system. The indications are that the governing party, the CPC, has reached a conclusion that it needs to adjust the political framework in view of the new challenges that that China has to face internally and of the strengthened role that China plays in international politics. But before doing this, the China party has thrown a deep eye on the past and another on the future. Looking at the concepts that were developed throughout history and the achievements also connected to these concepts throughout history, and giving indications about the conceptual framework for the future. Tonight, we will try to understand this whole issue of conceptual framework for Chinese action at the political realm. I, first of all, would like to thank Larissa, because Larissa was the one who had the idea of holding this seminar, and she took the responsibility of addressing the invitations and taking the burden of organizing it, together with Mariana and CEBRI staff. I also want to thank David Kelly and his colleagues from China Policy, Chi-Him Lee, Xu Meiyin, Malcolm Black, for taking their precious time to be with us tonight. Larissa, we are in your hands. From now on, you command.
Thank you, Ambassador Karamuru. Always a pleasure to share a panel with you. Thank you, CEBRI, for this opportunity, and I'm very happy to be part of this event. Thank you, David, for accepting our invitation, and a big thanks to your whole team, to Kate, to Filipa. Thank you for trusting us for that. So some brief words of introduction about David Kelly. David leads research at China Policy with the main responsibility for the geopolitics team. For over 30 years, his work has ranged widely across issues affecting China's economic, political, and social institutions. David is a regular media commentator on Chinese affairs for media such as the BBC, the ABC, Financial Times, The Economist, you name it. He holds a PhD in Chinese studies from the University of Sydney, has held a Fulbright Fellowship at the University of Chicago, and worked at the Australian National University, the University of New South Wales, the National University of Singapore, and Peking University. He's someone that we always like to listen to. So David, the floor is yours. We'll listen to your presentation now, and later on when we have the Q&A session, I will also briefly introduce our other speakers as well. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Larissa. And I think I'm off mute. I'm live to air. Well, let me thank you.
You're good to go, yes.
Thanks to you, Larissa, and thank also to Ambassador Karamuru, who is an old friend. And indeed, we have had the most warm and exciting relations with the Brazilian embassy in Beijing over a decade, probably quite a bit longer. And as a result, both our managing director, Philippa Jones, and I myself have been invited to Brazil to give presentations. My own case took me to Sao Paulo in about 2012. I'd have to look that up, but I know that at that time, President Xi was basically an unknown quantity to us. We only had very dry kind of biographies that appeared for a vice premier, as he was, or for a provincial party secretary, as he had been. And also at that time, of course, the whole policy outlook of the 18th Party Committee of 2012 was unknown. We were still at that time dealing with quite serious consequences of the global financial crisis, and those are still with us. And I think that they are still in play in a lot of what I'm going to be talking about today. We're seeing sometimes secondary, tertiary, quaternary after effects of the global crisis of that time. And that's before Brexit, that's before Trump and before COVID. And I'm going to be returning to a theme that might be to our sponsors, our banking sponsors, they may feel that this is a little bit overfamiliar, and that is the theme of risk management and risk aversion. Of course, a banker is trained in risk management, I'm sure, and it may seem that this can hardly be a dominant theme of a national policy. Yet I think it is, and I will try to spell that out. As you will see from my overhead, and perhaps we can go through my overhead as quickly at this point. I will speak to, as Ambassador Karamuro said, the larger meaning, the larger implications of this whole switch. But my colleagues are ready to discuss concrete policy. So let me say, first of all, my first takeaway, if I can call it that, this meeting, this 6th Plenum and the resolution emerging from it operate on two distinct levels. One is the rhetorical level of the narrative that China presents and seeks to promote. And the other important dimension is the actual policy level of what wheels are set in motion by any changes in the first dimension. And my conclusion is that very little has happened in that first level, which I call the doctrinal level. I don't call it ideology because there is new doctrine and there is new ideology, but ideology is a constant. There has never been a time in my experience, and it goes beyond 30 years, it probably goes to 50 years since I started reading about China. There's never been a time when ideology was not important. It was not, in fact, the first business of the leadership. So I'm going to be saying that on the doctrinal level, very little change can be really tracked down and identified. Nearly any points I could make, and which other commentators have made so far around the world, nearly all of those points can be traced back to earlier points in time. They have been there before. We've been through most of this language before. But that is not the same as saying there is no policy implication. No, far from it. The policy implications are manifold, and my colleagues really keep their eyes on those aspects, and a lot of the discussion can really be faithfully handled by them. So let me go through. The very first thing you'll see in my presentation is the expression splitting the ideological difference. And that, to my mind, it took quite a while to form in our opinions. And the point I want to make there is, as you will have heard from many other sources, and I don't intend to tell you boringly all over again that there have been previous 6th plenums which led to major historical resolutions of the party. if we can call the 1945 plenum and the 1981 plenum under Mao and Deng Xiaoping respectively, if we call them super plenums in meeting certain criteria of importance and significance, this plenum is not a super plenum. I would say that under any reasonable interpretation of the past, this plenum has held back from the ambitions of those two meetings. And this can be explained in several terms. When this plenum was being planned, let me move on to my first slide, and I'll let you digest that as I speak, and I'll come back to some of the points I'm making there. But please understand, this is not meant to be an empirical PhD sort of chapter 1 literature review of the 6th Plenum. This is in fact what the PhD thesis should be saying in its conclusion. This is the limits of stretching our mind around what is going on. So it is not a super plenum in that when planning this plenum, Party Secretary, General Secretary Xi Jinping could have chosen to go further left than Mao or further right than Deng. If we allow the words left and right in their Chinese sense, and they don't quite line up with the international meanings of those words. But the point of a super plenum is to mark a turning point in history for the People's Republic of China. I compare it to a sort of M dash. If you were writing an article, you only use an M dash to show that something is dramatically different. Otherwise, you use a comma. Otherwise, you use a colon or a left parenthesis and so on. This is an M dash. It's meant to be, I am now putting in front of you, I as leader of China am placing in front of you a new dispensation, a new policy order, and maybe even a new policy language. That was the case before. It is not the case now. And instead of going, next slide, please. I don't think. Instead of trying to do what Mao did, which is supersede his rivals in the party who had been pro-Soviet, or Deng, who's trying to supersede his rivals in the party who had been pro-Mao, Xi Jinping is not superseding anybody seriously. He is splitting the difference. He is finding the points which absolutely must be adhered to, and he is making them as fresh and dramatic as he can. Nonetheless, if you have found any absolutely new point of doctrine in these documents, in the communique or in the resolution, please let me know. I'd love to discuss them with you. We can see breaks with the past. You can see that I've nominated some breaks of the past on this slide, which is going to what would make a super plenum. Mao broke with the past, Deng broke with the past. I'm afraid something is sitting in front of this, a little notice from, yeah, it's preventing me seeing my own, yes, good. Right. And in the case of this current meeting, the break is essentially with high growth. And to my mind, that is not on the same historical, almost cosmic level as those previous meetings. I've been a little bit provocative in some of the other things. On the previous slide, you'll see I spoke of the foreign godfathers of these three phases of history. And the idea being that in Mao's day, Karl Marx was still an important authority figure, still a living presence. You can read thousands of autobiographies of Chinese who in the 30s and 40s were true believers in Marxism. And they had, in many cases, good reason to be, in that alternatives appeared to them to have failed, and so forth. By 1981, there had been a sea change. And it was clear to many people whom I met at that time. I myself was a student in the Beijing Language Institute in the late Cultural Revolution, and I am quite sure that many people were ready to move on, and in particular, the politics of China itself could no longer be explained in simple Marxist terms. The behavior of the Gang of Four, the behavior of Mao himself, and the requirement of the country as it struggled between the so-called whateverist faction and the Deng Xiaoping and his reformist faction did not have a clear Marxist meaning. It had a meaning in Stalinist terms because it was not unlike struggles in the Soviet Union. But we'll leave that aside, and you probably all know too much about this already. But the other three dimensions, or the three indicators of these phases that I want to get to, is that Mao's doctrine, standing back from it, looking at historically, looking at it in comparative political, sociological, geopolitical terms, was a doctrine of Sino-modernity. And this is stated, in fact, very clearly in these recent texts, in the communique, and in particularly in the historical resolution that has just appeared. Xi Jinping and his team make a great deal of reference to modernizing China by means of sinified Marxism. And here the important word is sinified. Zhongguohua. This is something which starts off foreign and ends up local. And in moving to a local frame of reference, a great deal of the original content is altered. We don't have time to go into that. This would be huge. But by the time of 1981, it has again changed. And what we have seen for the past 4 decades does not resemble that Sino-modernity of the 1940s, which propelled China into its first phase, the People's Republic of China. And the doctrine which has really been operating, I would argue, at the background is, again, a sinified neoliberalism. And I'm happy to go into that in questions. But I want to stress that some people have said, oh, but neoliberalism was all over several years ago. If you mean neoliberalism in the sense of Reaganism, Thatcherism in the UK, that form of neoliberalism, which was in fact influenced by an economist named Friedrich Hayek. Nonetheless, there is a very powerful and important Chinese strain of this thinking. And many people in China will tell you off the record that Hayek has been enormously important in their life, and the idea that you must achieve wealth and power by means of markets, by means of underlying market institutions, is still a very powerful force in China. Nobody can doubt that. But once again, we have turned a corner, and I'm happy to talk about a new doctrine, and I'm happy to call it, this is my own word as far as I know, if anyone else has invented this, then please, my cap is off to you. Sino-neo-socialism. That might seem strange. We think that China is socialist, but the socialism, as Ambassador mentioned in passing, there is a Chinese socialist strain of thought which is putting an M dash after the Deng Xiaoping era. And we see this particularly in the doctrine of common prosperity. We see it in, and my colleagues will go into this, we see this impulse in the regulation of big tech. We see this in the regulation of the cultural sphere. The most recent case being attacks on high-tech entrepreneurs in the name of some common value system. And the leader of this is a certain gentleman named Sima Nan, whom I remember from 10 years ago as a prime defender of Bo Xilai and the Chongqing model. Next slide, please. So in concrete terms, and my time, I must take a look at how much time I have and move on quickly.
It's okay. You still get 10, 15 minutes, no problem.
Oh, great. Now, this is more cut and dried. I think you will have read this in The Economist or the Financial Times, the New York Times, everywhere, and you'll probably even have read it in People's Daily and Global Times. The plenum meets expected criteria. It lionizes Xi Jinping. It paves the way for his third term. It justifies party rule via its scorecard. And it rescripts a narrative framing of Xi's new era. Now, there's nothing surprising there. This could have been predicted, and I'm sure that we, in fact, would have predicted that 6 months, a year ago. You could hardly not have a 6th Plenum, which then, even then, beforehand, promised a new historical resolution without these elements. Now, my next set of points is what again, is to recap what I've said about where this, in a sense, defeats expectations. It heralds no new constitutional era. If we look back at 1945 and 1981, not too many of the commentators have noticed that after the historical resolution, within a couple of years, not immediately following, but within a couple of years, there was a new constitutional order. In the 40s, the late 40s, we saw the beginning of what was called New Democracy. This was Mao's doctrine of how he could win the war and how he could displace the Nationalist Party, which, of course, touted itself as a election-based, as a liberal democracy. So he instituted the multi-party system that China has, the satellite parties, and a lot of other apparatus. And so a lot of the ways in which state ownership worked over the next 20, 30 years was set not long after that historical resolution. In 1981, again, it was not long before the 1982 Constitution of the People's Republic of China appeared. And that was a major shift. It now brought in the idea of legitimate market actors. And so you had the basis of the reform era and the ensuing monumental growth of the Chinese economy. If we now ask, what new constitutional era is promised in this historical resolution? I can't find it. If you found it, please let me know. I can see the scorecard. Yes, there's a great attention given in the historical resolution to the achievements, and the achievements are undeniable, but also, I think, very noticeable. The resolution is jam-packed with accounts of human frailty, moral turpitude, corruption, and the righteous actions of the political leadership in dealing with these problems. I'm not sure that this was comparable to anything in those earlier. Of course, the first of the resolutions under Mao delivers crushing political blows to his rivals. And these were essentially followers of the Moscow line within the party through those early years. And in the case of the 1981 historical resolution under Deng Xiaoping, there are crushing blows to the terrorists and to the Gang of Four and to many enemies within the party. And I've said you may have noticed on the first overhead that those meetings, there were quite different constituencies of receivers of these messages. In the 45 case, Mao could quite confidently speak to a social bloc called the masses. The masses, however, were not in the cities. The cities and the city workers that existed at that time were not under his command. They were within the area ruled by the nationalists or by Japan. In his area, in the fastnesses of the far northwest around Yan'an, he basically spoke to workers and peasants and soldiers. The workers were very few, the peasants were very many. And that was a different constituency from that which Deng spoke to all those years later. He was by then in control of the whole country, but his messaging in that resolution was not really to the whole country. It was to a very large extent to the party itself, because the party had suffered so grievously in the recent years of the late Cultural Revolution. And now we ask, who is the constituency of the present message? Well, of course, at one level, it's the entire country, because the party has the means of communication. It has the media, it has print, it has television, it has internet, it has WeChat, and it has any number of other channels. But I would argue, and I'll leave this for later, that the prime constituency that we can identify in the current new documents is in fact the urban haves. I call them the urban hukou holders. I'm sure everyone is aware of the hukou system, which is an internal residency-based status system. If you hold a hukou, if you hold a residency in a major city, you have access to high levels of welfare compared to those who do not. And in many ways, there is no attempt in this document. Someone is ringing a bell. We will soon have that silent. There is no strong attempt that I can see in this document to make strong promises for hukou reform. I think we're going to be in the hukou system for some time to come. Of course, things can change, but this is what we see at the moment. Now, the final point I want to draw out, and this is the one that I hope that perhaps the ambassador will have some insight into. To my mind, the new documents change the tone of the Xi Jinping administration's foreign policy in recent times. It's not direct. These are not foreign policy documents. But I will argue that whereas from the beginning of Xi Jinping's administration in early 2013, and particularly after the 19th Party Congress in 2017, and through the years of building up the Belt and Road Initiative, the rhetoric of foreign affairs was dominated by concepts of win-win, a community of a shared future. In other words, of an outgoing and, if you like, a reassuring tone to the whole world. Not only reassuring, in fact, promising great dividends to the whole world. To my mind, this tone has been not shut off, but has been wound back. If any of you are amateur audio producers, I would say that the fade control has been applied. They're not silenced, but they have faded somewhat. Next slide, please. What is strongly in the new dispensation are a couple of things which are not new. They do not constitute a super plenum. They do not constitute a new constitutional order, but they are a new language of policy. And I think this is of great interest. There is great attention to the rationality and efficacy of government. This is hardly revisionist or revolutionary. In many ways, it fits the facts that the great danger that China faces now is no longer the Japanese invasion or the nationalist regime. It's no longer the Gang of Four or the late Cultural Revolution. It is, in fact, the vested interests and the negative consequences of high growth. So that is why I've earlier said that this is an era which is trying to turn a chapter on the era of high growth. So what were the lessons? What in particular are these documents trying to get away from? What are we steering away from in the recent era, the late Deng Xiaoping era? If it's time to move away from Deng Xiaoping, what in particular do you have to move away from? And one of them I would suggest is what is called in Chinese games of interest. This is the expression li boi, which many of you will have come across. This is how people in China will discuss many policy issues. Many policy issues are not about right and wrong, left or right, socialism or capitalism. They are about who benefits. Cui bono, if you, I'm sure you know the Latin expression, who benefits. And we can read this out of the policies this year, which have cramped the style of big tech and which have moved on a number of interests, the movements against Alibaba, against Didi Chuxing and other listed companies who were not allowed to take the kinds of investment bets that they hoped to take. And it has been discernible for the last 2 years how much the policy language has devoted to risk. Of course, the people have objected to this. Oh, but the Chinese regime has always been risk averse. It has always paid great attention to negative outcomes. I would beg to differ. We should agree to differ on that. I think the question is not whether or not a regime is aware of risk. It's the way in which risk is structured, the way in which risk management is shared among agencies. It's all very well to have the People's Procuratorate, which is meant to attend to the risk of corruption within the party. But in many cases, we have seen that the previously established agencies to deal with risk were themselves sources of immense risk. And this was because, again, they could not control their capture by interests. And so we've seen the rise of risk factors in the last several years, registered in many ways. Of course, we're in the era of high growth. We're at the end of the era of high growth. Let me be clear about that. The era of high growth ended quite some time ago. And we are on the edge of the end of the demographic dividend, which is part of the same story. Demographic dividend was a major factor in high growth. And we are on the edge of decoupling. Decoupling has not taken place, but the real threat of decoupling suddenly emerged at the end of the Obama and through and then, of course, exaggerated through the Trump years and not resolved in the Biden years. China always discounted decoupling. The think tanks were of the opinion that the world needed China for many reasons, and that no one would dare to think of decoupling. Well, they have dared to think of it. This means it becomes a risk factor. I don't want to put a figure on it. I don't want to give it a probability, but I am convinced that in Beijing and the Zhongnanhai, people are aware of decoupling, and that is in the background of major policy shifts like dual circulation, and now it is also playing into common prosperity. Could I have the next slide, please? I'll try to get through my remaining slides as quickly as possible. I've said that if we look at the documents, we don't see a new ideology, but we see some new subtext to the existing ideology. As we know, there's been a great playing through, a reconsideration of China's scorecard, and Xi Jinping is able to say things that Mao and Deng could never have said. He's able to point to financial power in the world at large that they only dreamed of. And he's able to talk about advanced industrial sectors that they only dreamed of. But these are not radical claims, and they would not constitute a new era. In fact, high growth happened before. High growth happened under Deng Xiaoping and his successors, Jiang Zemin and Hu Jintao. In a sense, very importantly, the Xi Jinping era has to manage the lower expectations of post-growth. So we see these two themes being sounded in these documents in the subtext, and the first of them is rationality. Rationality is a Chinese value. You will find references to Li and Li Xing in very ancient times. It was clear to the Han dynasty that its predecessor, the Qin Shi Huang totalitarian regime, had been in many ways completely irrational, had been dominated by, if you like, overreach and ancient forms of fascism, ancient forms of populism, burning all the books, burying the scholars. And when the Han dynasty came back, they believed themselves to be, this was a return of the reasonable people, a return of good guys. And this theme has been taken up and accentuated over time. It's a huge story. I can't possibly go over it. But what's involved and what we should be looking for in a policy sense is statements which evaluate reason over sentiment, selflessness over interest. Now, this is very distinctively Chinese. Selflessness over interest is, in the United States, incredibly controversial. If Biden says you should all have a vax shot and put your own interests secondary to the community, he runs into political trouble. It's not over yet. We don't know the end of that. But in China, it would be very extraordinary for a similar sentiment to arise, even among the netizens, the users of China's Facebook equivalent. Very few people are going to say, I want my freedom, I'm not going to be vaxxed, because selflessness still has enormous cultural momentum. Another theme that I'm seeing, and which is probably not all that dramatic, is the ironing out of inconsistencies. In the past, we would have looked at the Chinese policy sphere and not seen a lot of this. It tended to be the case that if a new policy came along, it would not replace the old policy. And in fact, it was a tendency of China, some would say a strength, that you pilot something new even while the old is going. And a lot of attention has been given to this. Professor Heilemann in Germany and some other scholars have written about this piloting and the use of a project here and a project there. If it ran on different principles to some other project, who cares? But now we're seeing attention to ironing out inconsistencies. And I have no idea where that will lead, but my colleagues might very well do. And of course, self-criticism and self-correction is being sounded again. This is an old theme. It has its ancient equivalents, but it is now meant to be, very importantly, computer assisted. It is now possible to do things that are called deep learning, network learning, and so forth. And enormous amounts of this sort of self-correction are imaginatively incorporated in the AI revolution and in what is called the social credit administration. Next slide, thank you. Efficacy is the other part of it, and efficacy there we see sounded in the documents. Wars on corruption and poverty, which are claimed to have been successful. There's a great deal of attention to having met targets, meeting targets. Again, none of this is surprising. None of this can be called novelty. None of this can be called intellectual breakthrough. This is what is expected of a modern regime. But the last point, and this is the one I want to leave you with, and this is my last comment. For the last 2 years, there's been enormous attention to a doctrine of policy or a policy tone of voice, which in Chinese is called baseline thinking, 底线思维. And this is mentioned in person by Xi Jinping, and after he mentioned it, it was then echoed throughout the system down to the village level. The village mayor would get up and speaking about COVID or speaking about the flooding or some other emergency was saying, we must adhere to baseline thinking. I think most of the outside world regarded this as a purely managerial topic on the of a non-charismatic kind. This is all part of a regime which has now traveled very, very far from the utopian ideas of Mao and even those of Deng. But it's I think of importance, and I've tried to analyze this, I've tried to document this, that in the use of this concept of baseline thinking. By the way, baseline is not bottom line. Bottom line is often used to translate that same Chinese word. But to my mind, bottom line concept is an accounting concept. Yes, it's used for lots of things, and we all use it a lot of the time. But a baseline is not a bottom line. A baseline is, we should think of a baseline in baseball. If you think of a baseline in soccer. Think of these are lines which you are, the important thing about these lines in rhetorical terms is you don't cross them. These are lines that you're not meant to cross. So you're meant to keep a baseline. You're meant to prevent anything crossing that baseline. And we have seen, and I say, and particularly in foreign policy, particularly in areas like Belt and Road and the application of risk management to Belt and Road, that there has been a slide, there has been a movement from what was originally, as I noted before, win-win thinking or common human destiny. When we look into the history of the word baseline thinking, it is about not those things. It is about worst case scenarios, what is sometimes called worst, I've forgotten the exact expression, but zero sum. At the end of the day, it's my baseline, not your baseline. We cannot talk easily about win-win when we're talking about baseline concepts. A baseline is not a win-win area. In fact, these are games like soccer or chess, where what you enjoy is the fact that there has to be a winner. That's what makes that game important. So one final slide, and that'll be my wind up. We are seeing the routinization of charisma. If you haven't come across that seems wild. Please Google it. You'll find 1,000 hits on that. It comes from the works of Max Weber, and it says that the revolutionary movements cannot stay revolutionary. Sooner or later, they have to stipulate that something is business as usual. You still might try to cling on to charisma. The Pope cannot walk on water like Jesus Christ, but the Pope can give people the communion. This is how all movements change over time. So we now have a leader who is no longer charismatic in the old sense, but is making claims to institutionalization, to rules-based governance, to high quality. And his constituency, which I've outlined, is to a large extent, the urban hukou holders want predictability. And that, I think, is the new era we're in. Thank you, everybody.
Well, thank you very much, David, for such an insightful speech, and so many ideas you throw at us that we need some time to digest them. And I'm glad we get the Q&A to understand a little bit deeper some of your key points. So thank you very much for that. I'm gonna invite now our analysts from China Policy. They are part of David Kelly and Felipe Jones' team at China Policy. And those are Chi-Him Lee. Chim Lee leads China Policy Science, Technology, and Innovation team. He specializes in digital economy trends, including industries like artificial intelligence, semiconductors, 5G, and all these related issues with such as cybersecurity, competition policy, digital components of the Belt and Road. So thank you, Chi, for joining us. Malcolm Black. Malcolm leads China Policy coverage of macroeconomics and trade issues as China seeks to balance growth and structural reform. His areas of interest include monetary and fiscal policy, continued attempts to pivot the economy away from real estate, and balance between public and private sector roles. And I'd like to welcome Mei Ying. Mei Xu heads the social policy portfolio at China Policy. She tracks and analyzes the social cultural transformation accompanying China's economic transition and the development of social policy in the context of marketization and globalization. Mei Ying's research focuses on demographics, education, healthcare, and urban-rural relationships. She advises leading global players in higher education, pharmaceuticals, and medical devices and public sectors. As you can see, as our audience can see, China Policy's analysts are very much focused on policy. So this is what we're going to be talking about, how this new era that David just described, what implications will this new era have for policies in China? And of course, everyone in the globe is wondering about how it's going to affect each of us, like different countries that have relations with China and that do business with China. And David has thrown very interesting ideas to us. So we're very curious to understand how this rationality and efficacy will affect the relation that China has with its partners. Of course, policy, internal policy, domestic policy, but also how it's going to affect the relation that China has with other players in the globe. So I'm gonna start the Q&A session now, and we have some questions lined up here for our commentators and for David Kelly. So I'm going to start with David. And David, I'd like to ask you, what does the 6th Plenum and its resolution mean in terms of global positioning for China?
Let me just make sure I'm not muted. Yeah. Well, that's the toughest question, because these plenums are not, as we said, they're not, they don't fit into the bureaucratic rhythm as the appropriate point for foreign policy. It's actually the National Party Congress, which starts the process. This is the 6th meeting after that. So there's been a 1st plenum, there's been a 2nd, a 3rd, and a 4th. And the 2nd and the 3rd and the 4th have their stated realm of authority. And the realm of authority of this meeting is not really external. It's very largely domestic. But China's interface with the world is now such that it would simply be absurd to say there was no foreign policy readout. Excuse me, I need to take a sip of some water, I think.
Please go ahead if you need it, and we can pause here.
Can I make a comment just in the middle of your presentation of this question? The comment is the following. I appreciated very much when you said that the concepts of foreign policy, like the win-win, global community and all that. That's what China has been saying. But there's something that impressed me in the new text, which is the idea that they say it like exactly like this: China will become a global leader in terms of composite national strength and international influence. It's not very common to listen to see China saying this, isn't it?
You're right, but there is a huge ambiguity here. In English, we can speak of several leaders at once. The word leader is often plural. Leaders met. They're all leaders, they're all equivalent. Chinese political culture has not always had such a concept. At times there have been plural. There were great important eras in which China is not even first among equals, you know. Is that primum inter pares? I think that. In fact, in those, if memory serves, in times when some of the big dynasties were breaking up, like the late Song, late Han, China, in fact, the entity which we now call China was one of a number of powers. There were non-Han kingdoms with which China dealt, and not necessarily dealt with in the later sense of a tributary system in which China is definitely the top dog and other people come to it for grace and favor, hoping to send their young people for an education, for example. And at those times, China behaves more like a modern state. But they are relatively few in history, and they were often superseded by very strongly, let's call them Sinocentric regimes. The Ming, in particular, the Ming period, shows that the fact that the country had been conquered by a Mongol power, Genghis Khan, drove Chinese culture into what we now call involution, a very popular term in China now, Neijuanhua. And even the Qing, the Manchu dynasty with which the British and the later Western powers dealt. Of course, Portugal dealt with the Ming and the Yang, but they had to deal with a very inward-looking power that would never have used the word leader in a plural sense. The implication would be there is one leader. That is what I think the whole thing rests on. It turns on a kind of the meanings of those words. By leader, do you mean, do you in your subconscious hold to the idea there can only be one tiger on the mountaintop? I don't know in the current setting, but there are people in the Chinese foreign policy world who think like that. You will pick up that kind of connotation from some people writing for Global Times. But I've been aware, and my interest has been in those people who don't think like that. And I can quote you any number of them. You may yourself have met, Ambassador, have met Shi Yanhong, a professor at Renmin University, and any number of others. Ren Jintao, also at Renmin International Studies Department. They criticize this tendency. They know that it's a weakness. This is the core of overreach. Overreach stems from this view that at the end of the day, everyone's got to come around and accept that China is actually the best at, say, justice. China knows what justice is. How could it not? It's older. And if you're older, you know more. Well, the rest of the world doesn't agree. In fact, it's some of the newly established nations of the world, which might include, by the way, yours and mine, don't think for a minute that because we're not historically old, that we don't have a view on fundamental value issues. So I tend to believe that this will be sorted out, and that we're going through an exaggerated phase of nationalism now, in which it is imagined that, the expression is used, China, 中国站起来, 中国富起来, and now 中国强起来. That is to say, China stood up, China got rich, and now under the Xi dispensation in the new era, China will become powerful. It should not mean that we'll become the sole power. But we are at the mercy of future developments there. We don't know the end of the story.
Thank you, David. Thank you. I'm going to ask now Malcolm about his views on the 6th Plenum and its meaning for the role of GDP targets moving forward, especially as we talk about rationality and efficacy. How do you see that developing, Malcolm?
Yes, thank you. So as David had mentioned, that the 6th Plenum kind of turns the page on this era of high growth. And kind of the key to this is then the GDP targets and the way that they play a role in the policy system and the economic policy system. And we saw in the 6th Plenum that they kind of took a strong stance against the GDP targets, putting some of the blame for the current economic imbalances on this previous pursuit of high growth. And so this is the most recent in a string of actions we've seen over the last couple of years that are starting to weaken the role of GDP targets as this prime economic driver. So in 2020 with COVID, we saw that they decided not to put a GDP target and they chose to use employment targets as well as a few others due to the extreme nature of COVID's impact on the economy. And then moving into 2021 with the 14th five-year plan, we see that they chose not to set an overall 5-year target, but they will set them each year individually. So we see this being almost a middle ground between having a GDP target for the 5 years versus having no GDP target ever. And so this was kind of a transition period. So what does this mean actually for economic policy moving forward? So as the economy slows down and the drivers start to shift away from some of the more traditional things you would think about, such as infrastructure or primarily real estate or housing, which we see start to create some of the risks, as David mentioned, this kind of risk management section. So we see with real estate, there are risks such as Evergrande or the financial challenges, as well as with just the kind of unpopularity of high housing prices. So those are some risks that have to be addressed. And with infrastructure, we see the increase in local government debt, as well as you build more infrastructure, the returns start to diminish naturally. So this kind of idea of the risk of too much investment going to low returns. And so the idea now becomes that they have to shift away from these growth drivers and to shift more towards some of the new ones, such as kind of these high-tech developments, so AI or other high-tech goods, as well as other ones such as consumer spending or green development, we often hear about. So the GDP targets and this new shift away from them, or attempt to shift away, is more of a signal rather than a concrete policy, and it's a signal that officials should start to think about things less in the way of these real estate or infrastructure drivers, but more of how to invest in education or other public services that will lead to more sustainable growth. Now, unfortunately, it's not exactly a thing where you can just snap your fingers and this all happens overnight. While yes, the GDP targets had a role in creating this reliance on either infrastructure or particularly real estate, there are also a lot of developments at the individual or at the local government level which drive these, such as the local government's reliance on real estate financing due to the imbalance between central and local government taxes, as well as individuals using real estate as a long-term asset because there isn't necessarily that confidence in financial markets to develop their savings. So these are more the difficult challenges rather than just switching, say, from having GDP targets to no GDP targets. And to do this, then you would expect to see a much broader policy actions or a much wider range of policies, a much wider range of policies. And to some degree, we are seeing this. The new announcement on the real estate tax pilots, maybe in some ways a view of more to come. But in general, these are going to be rather long-term trends that are going to be gradually rolled out. Optimistically, or I guess pessimistically, you'll see that some of these, as David said, these games of interest might win out at the lower level, and you maybe won't see as much positive developments. That's kind of what we're seeing with GDP targets and how they will fit into both this new kind of regime moving forward and what that means for economic policy in a broad sense.
Thank you very much, Malcolm. I'm going to welcome now Tim and ask him about his views on where are the tech giants heading in 2022 or the next years, the years to come. What are your views on that, given this whole potential policy rearrangements that we have been discussing about?
Right. Yeah, perhaps perhaps a bit of a background for the audience here. Over the last 1 year or so, we've been seeing a very much changing environment for China's tech companies. So China is quickly catching up with other jurisdictions in Europe or in the US and other places on enforcing competition law. So and which is quite interesting because when you think about it, the sort of the more popular narrative in among advanced economies is that China has been very much supporting these companies, giving them lots and lots of subsidies. But that has changed quite a lot as these companies has grown increasingly anti-competitive. So the level of competition in China for these companies is really, really high from what you would have expected in the West. So, for example, in say, like the equivalent of it is that if say WhatsApp would be blocking users from using Amazon shopping links, so which would be rather ridiculous, but that is what is sort of happening in China. But beyond competition, you're also looking at these tech giants over the years being a lot more exploitative of labor, as also increasingly violating people's privacy as well as data security. And all of this means that, at least in Beijing's mind, this is not very beneficial to the China's society and the economy. So as David has mentioned as the presentation, we are looking at a break from high growth. So in the 6th Plenum, we are looking at how, like in the text itself, we can see that regulating these companies is emphasized as part of the structure, part of the long-term interests for China. And so for these companies, they are not going to see, they're not going to grow as fast as previous years. But that doesn't mean that they're not going to grow, because they are still very important for China's strategic and security aspirations. But these companies are very much required to protect better labor rights, being less anti-competitive, and also protecting the security, cybersecurity, and whatnot. So what we're seeing in 2021 is that these short-term administrative measures have worked very, very well. Some of these measures have really curbed all these anti-competitive tendencies. But to make sure that these companies can, invest in areas that China would want, say in semiconductors, in AI, and whatnot. What we're expecting, hopefully, in the next 1 year or so, especially ahead of the 20th Party Congress, is some sense of policy certainty. After a whole year of regulatory actions, we're expecting somewhat stable environment for these companies to think about their long-term strategies in terms of investing in research. But that, of course, is influenced by a lot of other factors as well. And this is a key step where Beijing would have to decide, do they still want to go for all these administrative campaigns that might hurt investment, that will hurt investment and entrepreneurial confidence, or do they want actually that to create this kind of long-term environment for these companies? So that's in brief what's happening in the tech sector right now.
Thank you very much, Ji-Him Lee. We're all watching, curious to see how those issues will develop. I'll just like to remind our audience that you can send us questions through the Q&A button. So please feel free if you'd like to address questions to any of our speakers. Ming, hi, I would like to welcome you now and ask you more about the common prosperity policy. If you could talk to us a little bit about what that means. And also, common prosperity is being trialed in one of the wealthiest provinces in China where it should succeed. So how relevant is it to the rest of the country?
Thank you. So common prosperity, it has been pretty much on the news recently in the past few months. And according to our research, common prosperity is in essence to cultivate a strong middle income group in the Chinese society and prevent this country the income gap between rural and urban areas and rich and the poor to further increase in later decades when the economy of this country is slowing down. So it does not mean to eliminate the rich or to ask rich to spend money on the poor. It does not mean that. It is in essence a policy initiative to make China a middle income class, a middle income country. So in terms of why Zhejiang ended up being the only pilot province for common prosperity, according to our research, well, like every time when Beijing is trying to select a candidate for pilots, there are in general two considerations that the decision makers have to think about. The first one is I would summarize it as an ease of implementing reforms. So they would like to find a candidate that they will be confronted with the least barriers possible when doing the pilots, which means reform. And the second consideration is that the effectiveness of the reform, the pilots, and the potential results they would have. So they wanted to find a place where they can learn as much as they can before the piloted initiatives are going to be rolled out nationwide. So according to these two standards, I would say Zhejiang is a good case, a good candidate, and probably the best candidate for common prosperity. So it is one of the richest provinces in China with the least regional gaps, income gaps across regions between rural and urban areas. It is the province with probably the strongest private sector in the country, and it has the largest middle income class compared to the other provinces. So last year in 2020, the GDP per capita in Zhejiang was about 14.6 thousand US dollars, which make it already an advanced economy according to the World Bank standards. And the urban-rural income gap was less than 2. So it is the third smallest in the country, I think, after Shanghai and Beijing. So since it's already pretty affluent with a pretty strong middle income population, it would be easier to test income equality measures in Zhejiang than, say, doing it in Guangdong, for example. So Zhejiang is also the province that is pretty successful in terms of implementing governance reforms. It is pretty transparent in public administration and pretty efficient. And the cadre, the civil servant that has been hired in this province are pretty capable of doing the reforms, both in the decision-making levels and the grassroots levels. So as my colleague Jim has explained, Zhejiang also hosts a group of tech giants, which would help the province to come up with some technology-based solutions for income equality measures. So for these two reasons, I would say Zhejiang is one of the places that it would be easier to for common prosperity reforms. And in terms of the final results, Zhejiang itself, it's a very diverse province. So not only it has cosmopolitan urban centers like Hangzhou, it also has hardcore manufacturing hubs and more traditional rural villages focusing on fishing industries, forestry, or agriculture. So this diversity resembles China as a country in many dimensions, and the representativeness it has means that the measures that are going to be tested in this province could be more practical to be rolled out nationwide, and the lessons learned would apply to other provinces and places across the country in the future. So in terms of how it is relevant for other provinces, as David presented in his slides, Beijing is very risk averse. So every time when it is doing a pilot, it would adhere to the gradualist approach. And I would expect after 5 years, there will be a second batch or later batches of pilots next to Zhejiang. And it would take some time before all those measures become a national standard. This is my story. Okay.
Thank you very much, Bing. Very interesting, and it is the seat of one of the largest tech companies. So a lot to look at Zhejiang province. I would like to get back to Chi and ask Chi about his views on the industrial policy trends, and if you can also look at how you think China's environment concerns might impact these industrial policy trends in the near future and the reorganization of production structures. We would be very interested in that. Thank you.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm sure environment concern is definitely one of the major themes that's going on in industrial policies. But I think going back to the more general part on industrial policies first is that the overarching narrative is what we're seeing is that China wants to be a lot more self-reliant. China is looking at a world where after the US-China trade war, after COVID-19, after a whole wave of deglobalization events around the world, and in this world, China is looking at a place where they need to rely on themselves. And if you recall just a few years ago, the main China 2025, there was more or less about boosting export competitiveness rather than focusing inwards in terms of self-reliance. But that has very much changed since then. And this is not just happening in industries, you're also looking at agriculture and commodities and all of this. They're looking at, in a sense, not just about relying on themselves, but also building connections to countries and regions that they found more friendly than certain other economies. So in industrial policies, so first, yes, environment policies is definitely affecting the industrial areas very much. So we are looking at several different industries receiving their own plans or drafting their own plans in carbon peaking and neutrality. So coming up very soon, we are expecting the steel industry, but other industries that are of very high emission, so say cement, as well as the metals, non-ferrous metals industries, these are all looking at a lot of initiative to reduce carbon emission. There's also the widely reported, I think, not just in China, but also in the rest of the world, China's carbon market, which on its establishment early this year, is already the biggest carbon market in the world, simply because of China's economic size. And this is also going to be a major tool in terms of reducing carbon emissions as well. And then in general, broadly in industrial policies, we are looking at several things. So there is a stronger emphasis on basic research. There is a more targeted approach in terms of business support as well. So on basic research, China sort of sees it as a source of innovation. It has been sort of the weakness in China in terms of the level of investment. So if you look at the other economies on the similar footing as China, they would have a much higher level of basic research already. But this has been an area of weakness, especially given that the kind of breakneck growth over the last few decades have not really been something that is, especially when you're growing a company, when you're growing entrepreneurship, is not really about basic research, is it? And then in terms of business support, we are looking at, as David mentioned, we are looking at sort of ironing out inconsistencies. So in the past, there is the approach of just throwing whatever subsidies we can find. Now it has changed quite a lot. We are looking at a much more restrained approach, at least from the top. Local governments are still trying to, throw subsidies to whatever firms they support. But we are seeing this narrative overall changing, in that they are targeting the competitive advantage, say in quantum or in AI or electric vehicles, but also China's weaknesses in terms of, say, semiconductors and areas that heavily reliant on imports. So these are the overall trends. Industrial policy is, of course, a very big topic. I can go on and on, but I'll just stop there for now.
Thank you very much. She was very enlightening. Malcolm, I have one question for you here in terms of the changes in the business environment in China. Do you see any changes? Do you feel that there are sectors concerned about increasing profitability, for instance, since we're talking about rationality, risk management, efficacy? How do you see that in terms of changes to the business environment? And I mean, for Chinese companies operating in China, but foreign companies operating in China as well. What does that mean?
Okay, so I guess starting it off from the foreign company view of it, I think the fundamental idea hasn't necessarily shifted, which is along the lines of does China need you versus do you need the Chinese market? And so as Tim has kind of mentioned a bit, and we talked a bit more about the emerging strategic industries and the idea of self-reliance, there are key industries that China feels like it needs to either close the gap with other countries or to develop their own self-reliance. And to their credit, the government is quite transparent about this. And so in these sectors, they encourage FDI, but as Tim mentioned, it's a bit more in a restrained manner than maybe, say, in the previous few decades. So in that sense, things are a bit so in that sense, things are shifting both for foreign companies and domestic companies. And so if that's, and that is if you are on the kind of quote unquote Chinese wish list. Now, if you fall outside of that group, then not to say they are anti-you, but they may be more indifferent to you because perhaps they have domestic alternatives, such as they have Decos instead of KFC, or their own kind of equivalent to Adidas or their sports clothing brands. So in that sense, there are domestic competitors that can fulfill those roles, so you aren't as needed. And because of that, then obviously you should expect, if you are the company, to be treated as less important. Now the key here is that as we talked about with the government, with the economy shifting, what falls under the Chinese wish list, or if that's what you want to call it, is naturally will change over time. This is both due to domestic changes in the economy, as well as just kind of global trends such as digital changes and other high-tech changes. So you see that for these companies, in some sense, the wish list is both shrinking, but also shifting to different sectors of the economy. So here we can see that in some sense, this may impact businesses for the worse, but if you are maybe on this wish list, some things may kind of benefit you. Now, so that's at the fundamental level. But if you delve deeper, I think there are two different aspects to look at this. One, the first of which I'll talk about, is the regulations. And as Tim has mentioned, we see a lot of this regulatory crackdown on the tech sector. And obviously, anytime governments roll out increased regulations, this is going to increase compliance costs for businesses, and particularly those who thrive in those gray areas. This may mean to some degree an end to your business, or at least some fundamental shifts. And we see this a lot with the online finance or the fintech companies such as Alipay, where they were really thriving in kind of calling themselves a tech company, but they're essentially a bank. So they didn't get regulated like a bank. So they were able to provide a lot of these cheaper services because they had lower costs of capital. But as the regulations expand to cover them and treat them more like financial entities, well, of course, their compliance costs are going to grow. So in this sense, it's very bad for these companies that were acting in these gray areas. Now, if you were a company who was already compliant, this may mean you have a step up ahead of your competitors who maybe weren't as compliant. So in that sense, it's a positive. The other aspect to this is that, and this falls under, I think David mentioned it, this whole rule of law idea, where we see a clearer path for what's allowed and what's not. And Jim mentioned a bit as well that we hope to see the dust kind of settle over the next year. And because we'll know what's allowed and what's not allowed, then entrepreneurs and businessmen can really focus in and focus their energies on what is allowed. So in this sense, it's, again, it may be a positive for businesses. But again, the negative here is that what if we don't see the dust settle quite as quickly? And a characteristic of the kind of regulatory crackdown we've seen this year is that it's constantly evolving. So I guess this is more under the kind of the slippery slope paradigm, where if this continues, then what maybe was a clear opportunity previously may not be so much. So here we kind of see this divergence, and we have yet to see where exactly the dust settles on the regulatory campaign. The other aspect to this, I would say, maybe falls more under kind of a PR style or a PR aspect of it. And this goes back to the idea of decoupling. And since, as David mentioned, we're really on the edge of decoupling, but what you're seeing a lot is that there's, and probably due to social media as well, but these companies who are now getting caught in between having to speak to the Chinese market and having to speak to their home market. So particularly you see companies in the US having to do this, where you have all kinds of human rights worries, as well as also to some degree green development, things like that. So in this sense, again, this is just going to be increased costs for businesses for PR or social media campaigns. And to exactly understand how you can split the difference and still be able to operate in both markets. And that is going to be a very difficult thing, particularly as social media continues to play such an increased role in our lives, and that everything these companies have said over the past 10 years or so can be very easily accessed. So again, here's another aspect where the business environment is kind of trending for the worse. So these are kind of the ways we see the business environment shifting. It does overall seem to be negative in some sense, but that doesn't stop there from being opportunities for companies to make money. I think quite telling was there was a survey, I think by Hang Seng Bank, which is a Hong Kong bank, and they did a survey on Chinese tech entrepreneurs, and the idea kind of goes back to this, that they felt like they had a better idea of where they can invest their time in, and then they feel like the government still encourages private sector investment in some of these emerging strategic opportunities. So there is optimism in that sense that there's still ways to make money in China, if you want to put it bluntly.
Thank you very much. And before I give the floor back to Ambassador Karamuru, who also has a question for us, I'd just like to highlight that CEBRI was able to put together a panel that has speakers from Australia, from the US, China, and Brazil. So that's very impressive, and I think that's a great opportunity that we're all together on this. Ambassador Karamuru, please.
Well, we are getting close to the time we have to close the debate. But I still want to make a provocation to David, actually a comment and a question. David, I must say I appreciated very much what you said, and I fully agree with you. You asked several times whether we saw a new doctrine in the document that was approved. Just like you, I didn't see any new doctrine. Actually, I was struck by the name of the resolution that was approved, because resolutions are in general about something that decisions about the future, isn't it? And then the resolution that was approved in the 6th Plenum is resolution on major achievements and historical experience over the past century. I mean, the resolution is about the past. Everything is a narrative. They needed a narrative. And I think that there are two ideas implicit in the narrative. One, the superiority over democracies and the regimes that exist in the West. Because which country is able to have a narrative of 100 years with that level of consistency and integration that they show in the resolution? No country would have. So there's a hint that this resolution expresses a certain superiority of the China model. And this is the other point about the narrative, is that the narrative is important for the party itself, isn't it? The party involves too many people, and they need a narrative. And then I kept asking myself, but why do they need a strong narrative at this point? Maybe because there are uncertainties about the incorporation of the narrative in the minds of everyone who's a leader at the local levels, at the provincial levels, etc. I don't know. Maybe you have clues of how to answer this. But the question, this is the comment. The question is the following: how do you see the new leadership in China? Because we know that Xi Jinping is going to have a new term, but the question is who's coming with him, isn't it? And we have seen recently a number of new leaders in provinces, people who are, some of them in their 50s, not yet in their 50s, a few of them 60 or 61, much younger than the leaders today. But my question is, how do you see the new leadership? Who's coming together with Xi Jinping in your view? Microphone.
You're muted, David. You're muted. You're on mute.
Why? Yes. In many ways, one of the great risk that is now presented by what will happen next year at the 20th National Party Congress, when Xi Jinping, as far as we know, will assume an unlimited term. For a political scientist, immediately the risk is gerontocracy. This was the case of the Mao era, when it is difficult to remove a political actor from the stage because of the accumulated debts that that person has used to rise to power. It becomes harder and harder to retire. Riding the tiger, it's hard to get off. It becomes very, very difficult for Xi and those around him to imagine peacefully living out their days like Hu Jintao or Jiang Zemin. But anyway, that's a kind of a cliche. Everyone knows that. To try and get at the essence of your question, Ambassador, what occurs to me, I'm just now translating a wonderful article by the economist Zhang Weiying. Now, you may very well have met him because in your tour of duty, he was the president of the Guanghua School of Management at Peking University. He was among the first people to be selected and trained as an economist early in the Deng Xiaoping era. And he has just published an article which is entitled "My Entire Life is Nothing But an Accident." And what he's doing there is he is telling students, I mean, he was forced to step down as the president of the Guanghua School of Management because his views ran opposite to the then orthodoxy, which was essentially that growth it was best to think of growth going on forever. It was unpopular. If you even spoke about growth not going on forever, you might end the growth. So he was in trouble for making a rational comment of that kind. He ends the article by saying, in my career, I will only ever adhere to human rationality. And to my mind, this is published in a highbrow internet aggregator called iSisiang, which I look at a lot because it has a ratings column. And this is currently high rating. This means a lot of the educated class, the think tank sort of people, and a lot of party people are reading it. And he is essentially speaking to the younger generation. You can see from the couple of points, it may have been a graduation speech or something like that. He is saying, I had no idea that I was going to end up an economist. He said, I only got into the university because the people of my background, he'd worked in the factory sector as a worker, I think, in the Cultural Revolution. He's of that age group. He's our age group, Ambassador. Were not being processed through the new education system. And he was basically scooped up and sent to the lowest rated discipline. The highest rated discipline, I think, would have been science. Scientists looked down on everyone else. And of those people in the liberal arts, people doing languages looked down on people doing political economy, which is the category that Marxism gave to economics as a discipline. So he was sent to the very last place he wanted to be. And he said, but it turned out that I liked it and I was good at it. So he's saying to the students, for heaven's sake, don't plan everything. And I think the subtitle of the article is, don't try to plan your whole career. So to my mind, I read this as the voice of deep wisdom. In fact, it's the deep wisdom of ancient China, ancient Greece, ancient Rome. Life is too uncertain. And if you box yourself in with fixed scales of value that says, I must become an economist, or I must be, in Korea, it would be, I must become a political scientist because, South Korea is the only country where political scientists have become president. You're probably going to be disappointed. So, and to my mind, this speaks against the whole current education philosophy, which itself blends into political ideology. The idea that the ends of human existence are known and are known to the party, and nothing else really counts, nothing else is of value. That is inimical to, in fact, to an innovative society. It's inimical to entrepreneurship. And Zhang Weiying himself is the grand old man of entrepreneurship. And if I can just finish on one point, he wrote about Zhejiang 20 or so years ago, and I happened to meet him in Singapore when I was in the East Asia Institute. He visited there and gave an astonishing article, which has stayed with me, on the nature of uncertainty. He was the only person speaking of uncertainty. What he said was that in Zhejiang, because Zhejiang had never been favored with institutions of the planned economy, they were allocated to the Northeast in many cases, or to the other big cities. Zhejiang had been left to private business, basically. And so it led the way with market reforms. And that is still true today. And that's exactly what my colleagues could have raised Meiying could have referred to that fact about Zhejiang. But he said there that because in a planned economy, in the planned sector, you could not judge the quality of an appointment to a CEO position. That was the reason that there was far more wage discrepancy under the planned system. And he said, intuitively, everyone in China assumed that a planned system would bring about greater equality. But in fact, the planned system paradoxically caused the greatest Gini coefficient, the greatest income gap, because of uncertainty. And because in Zhejiang, you knew that a company in Zhejiang would probably, on the balance, appoint on merit to a CEO position. This affected the entire investment atmosphere. Of course, he's a champion of market forces, Zhang Wing, but this kind of thinking is still alive and well, and I thought that was quite interesting, and I think it might have some resonance for you.
Thank you very, very much. With this very interesting comments, we have to close our debate. I want to thank David, thank Malcolm, Shumayin, and Chip, and Lee for joining us today. Thank again Larissa for the initiative of holding this discussion and conducting the debates. Thank our sponsors, BOCOM BBM, and say good night to all of those in Brazil. Good morning to those who are not in the West. But I think we have people here in the West and in Asia. And then take care. Thank you. Good night.